If you are anything like me, you are probably completely exhausted by the constant dizzying whiplash of nutrition advice.
Oh, absolutely. It is overwhelming for anyone.
Right. Because one day, a specific food is hailed as an absolute superfood. Like it's the biological key to eternal youth.
And then the very next morning.
Exactly. The next morning, a new headline screams that it is the worst possible thing you could ever ingest.
Yeah, it creates so much unnecessary anxiety.
It really does. You find yourself standing in the grocery store aisle, intensely scrutinizing nutrition labels, trying to calculate macros.
Trying to parse through all those conflicting scientific claims.
Yes, and just wondering why eating, which is a biological imperative we have to do every single day just to survive, has somehow become this advanced calculus problem.
It really shouldn't be that complicated.
Well, you can take a collective deep breath right now, because today we are tossing out those old, confusing food pyramids.
The ones we all grew up staring at on the backs of cereal boxes.
Those exact ones. We are stepping away from the 6-week fads, the biohacking quick fixes, and the contradictory clickbait. Instead, we are doing a deep dive into actual longitudinal science.
Which is incredibly refreshing.
Our source material today is a really dense, comprehensive breakdown of the groundbreaking work by Walter Willett.
And for those who might not know, Willett is a Harvard epidemiologist.
Frankly, he's one of the most cited nutrition researchers in the history of the world.
He really is. His work is foundational.
So our mission for this deep dive is to extract the absolute core principles of his healthy eating pyramid. We want to figure out why the metabolic quality of the food you eat dictates your health outcomes far more than rigidly counting every single calorie that crosses your lips.
That is exactly the right mindset to have as we approach this material. It is a pleasure to be here to break this down with you.
So glad you're here. Where should we start?
Well, what is absolutely crucial to understand right from the start is the methodology behind Willett's conclusions.
The way he actually got his data?
Right. Because the landscape of nutrition is utterly cluttered with short-term, tightly controlled clinical trials.
You mean those studies that might last, 6 weeks?
Exactly. 6 weeks, maybe tracking a dozen college students in a lab. And while those have their place for understanding acute mechanisms,
they don't tell you what happens over a lifetime.
Precisely. Willett's work represents something entirely different. He grounds his healthy eating pyramid in massive long-term epidemiological data.
Like the Nurses' Health Study, right?
Yes, the Nurses' Health Study and their health professionals' follow-up study. We are talking about tracking hundreds of thousands of people over decades.
That scale is just, it's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is massive. And they specifically chose nurses and medical professionals for these cohorts because they possess a high degree of health literacy.
Oh, that makes sense. They actually know how to report their data properly.
Right. They know how to accurately report their weight, their diagnoses, their dietary habits.
So it wasn't just a quick snapshot.
Not at all. It was a decades-long tracking of how actual dietary patterns correlate with the development of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and various oncological outcomes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the core argument of this entire body of work represents a massive, fundamental shift in how we think about public health.
It really is a paradigm shift.
We are talking about a shift from obsessing over the raw thermodynamics of food, just the calories, to deeply examining the biochemical type of food we consume.
Quality over sheer quantity.
Exactly. Willett is essentially taking a sledgehammer to the traditional food pyramid that was rolled out by the USDA back in 1992.
And it was a much-needed sledgehammer.
His central thesis is that human longevity is shaped far more by diet quality than by mere caloric restriction. But to really appreciate Willett's model, we have to look at what he was reacting against.
The 1992 pyramid.
Right, because the old USDA pyramid wasn't just scientifically flawed, it was structurally compromised from the very beginning, wasn't it?
It was profoundly compromised, yes. And this is a critical piece of the historical context. The United States Department of Agriculture has an inherent conflict of interest built into its very charter.
A dual mandate.
Exactly. On one hand, they are tasked with promoting American agricultural products.
Beef, dairy, wheat, corn.
Right. But on the other hand, they are simultaneously responsible for issuing public health guidelines for the nation.
Which seems like a massive collision waiting to happen.
And it did violently collide.
Yeah.
When nutritional science began indicating that the public should consume less of certain highly profitable agricultural products, the food industry lobbied aggressively.
So they actively changed the science for the public.
They altered the messaging. Drafts of the original pyramid were notoriously altered. For instance, language explicitly telling the public to eat less meat was softened to just say, choose lean meats.
Wow.
And the foundation of the pyramid was broadened to recommend an astonishing 6 to 11 servings of grain per day.
6 to 11 servings.
Yes. Treating a slice of highly refined white bread as metabolically equivalent to a bowl of intact steel-cut oats.
That is wild. But that historical context is so incredibly liberating for you, the listener, to understand. It completely reframes why we've all been so confused for our entire lives.
It takes the blame off the individual.
It really does. For decades, the public health message was essentially a mathematical guilt trip. Calories in versus calories out.
A rigid accounting exercise.
Yes. It put everyone on this endless treadmill of strict calorie counting, all while totally ignoring the hormonal cascade that different foods trigger inside the body.
Which is the most important part.
Right. What Willett's data is saying is that the thermodynamic model, while technically true in a closed physics system, is biologically inadequate for humans.
We are not bomb calorimeters.
Exactly. Instead of agonizing over a tiny numerical limit, you can redirect your psychological energy toward focusing on the type of fat, the type of carbohydrates, and the structural quality of the proteins you are consuming.
Precisely. It shifts the entire paradigm from deprivation and restriction to intelligent selection.
It feels so much more sustainable.
And the sheer statistical power of the data supporting this shift cannot be overstated. When we look at the Nurses' Health Study, we are observing what over 120,000 women actually ate in their daily lives.
Tracking them year after year.
Tracking their lipid panels, their inflammatory markers, and their disease rates. A short-term, 6-week metabolic ward trial might tell you how a specific macronutrient ratio affects acute weight loss.
But it doesn't tell you the long-term damage.
Right. It tells you absolutely nothing about what that diet does to your endothelial function or your pancreatic beta cells over a 20-year span. Willett's longitudinal data acts as the ultimate lie detector for nutritional theories.
It tracks the slow, cumulative, compounding effects of food on human biology.
Exactly.
It is the difference between a high-speed photograph and a 30-year time-lapse of human health.
That's a great way to put it.
And when Willett looked at that decades-long time-lapse, he started constructing his own pyramid. But here is the wild part. Something that instantly catches your eye when you look at his model.
The base.
Yes. When you look at the very base of Willett's new healthy eating pyramid, the foundation, the absolute most important level that anchors everything else, it isn't a macronutrient, it isn't even a food.
What's fascinating here is how he fundamentally redefines the baseline of human health. At the absolute bottom of the pyramid, functioning as the bedrock, we find daily exercise and weight control.
He explicitly places physical activity right there in a food pyramid.
He places it as the central, non-negotiable component of human health. The epidemiological data is unequivocal on this. Maintaining a healthy weight through active movement dramatically attenuates the risk of ischemic heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and specific hormonally driven cancers.
So by placing it at the base of a nutrition pyramid, he's making a statement.
A profound physiological statement. You cannot separate the fuel from the engine.
Which makes perfect intuitive sense. But let me play devil's advocate here for a moment.
Go for it.
Willett focuses heavily on sustainable weight control through daily movement and whole foods. But if we look at a lot of the modern longevity data, especially the clinical research surrounding intermittent fasting, prolonged fasting, and severe caloric restriction.
The autophagy research.
Exactly. We see robust evidence for extended lifespan in mammalian models. We see the triggering of cellular autophagy, which is the body cleaning out damaged cells initiated by states of starvation.
Right.
So how does Willett reconcile his sustainable, whole foods, daily eating approach with the longevity data that suggests pushing the body into extreme caloric deficits is actually highly beneficial?
That is a highly sophisticated question. And it requires us to separate acute cellular mechanisms from long-term epidemiological outcomes.
Okay, separate the two. How so?
Well, Willett is not arguing against the biological reality of autophagy or the benefits of fasting. However, his data looks at human behavior at the population level over decades.
Meaning what people actually do in real life.
Right. Extreme caloric restriction or aggressive fasting protocols might trigger beneficial acute cellular stress, but they are notoriously difficult for the general population to maintain over a 30-year time frame.
Most people just can't stick to it.
They can't. And when people attempt these extreme interventions and inevitably fail, they often rebound into binge eating.
Oh, which drives the weight right back up.
It drives wild fluctuations in weight, which the data shows is incredibly damaging to cardiovascular health.
The yo-yo effect.
Exactly. Willett's approach, fueling the body with high-quality, low-glycemic whole foods while keeping the metabolic engine running with daily exercise, achieves a similar regulation of insulin and mTOR pathways.
But without the starvation.
Without the psychological and physiological trauma of starvation protocols. It works in harmony with human behavior, not against it.
And the exercise plays a big part in that glucose regulation too, doesn't it?
A massive part. Muscle tissue, which you build and maintain through that foundational daily movement, acts as a massive metabolic sink for glucose. Yes. When you exercise, you increase the density of GLUT4 transporters in your muscle cells. This allows them to pull glucose out of your bloodstream completely independent of insulin.
So we have built the foundation. We are actively moving our bodies, utilizing our skeletal muscle as a glucose sink, and we are focusing on metabolic quality over agonizing caloric math.
That is the bedrock.
So what does this actually mean for the specific macronutrients we put on our plates? Because as we move up to the next level of Willett's pyramid, we crash headfirst into what is arguably the biggest paradigm shift in the entire source material.
We have to address the great fat debate.
Yes, the great fat debate.
This represents one of the most critical and life-saving corrections in the history of modern scientific literature.
Because we were completely lied to.
For the latter half of the 20th century, the public was fed a narrative that dietary fat was the ultimate enemy. The prevailing hypothesis was simple, almost brutally primitive.
Eating fat makes you fat.
And eating cholesterol raises your cholesterol. But Willett's epidemiological work meticulously dismantled that model. It forced the scientific community to distinguish between lipid profiles.
Specifically, the profound difference between good fats and harmful fats.
Exactly.
I really want to dig into the history of this because it completely shatters the myth that all fat is inherently bad for you.
It's a fascinating history.
If you lived through the 80s and 90s, you remember the sheer panic. Everything on the grocery store shelves proudly proclaimed it was fat-free.
From yogurt to cookies.
Right. As if that fat-free label was the ultimate guarantor of health. But this whole anti-fat crusade really started decades earlier, didn't it? With Ansel Keys and the 7 Countries study.
That is the exact origin point.
The data that demonized saturated fat and essentially opened the floodgates for the trans fat boom.
The historical context is vital for understanding Willett's rebellion here. In the mid-20th century, Ansel Keys published the 7 Countries study, which showed a correlation between saturated fat intake and heart disease.
And was he wrong about the saturated fat?
While his findings on saturated fat had merit, the public health takeaway was catastrophically oversimplified to just say, all fat is bad.
So the food industry panicked.
They did. When the food industry was told to remove saturated fats, like butter and lard, from their products to make them, quote-unquote, heart-healthy, they needed a replacement.
Something cheap.
Cheap, shelf-stable, and with a similar mouthfeel to butter. Enter partial hydrogenation.
The creation of trans fats?
Yes. The process of blasting vegetable oils with hydrogen gas to make them solid at room temperature. This created trans fats. Margarine was heavily promoted as the healthy alternative to butter.
But the data showed something else entirely.
What Willett's data from the Nurses' Health Study revealed was horrifying. Trans fats didn't just raise LDL, the bad cholesterol, they simultaneously plummeted HDL, the good cholesterol.
Oh wow, a double hit.
While triggering massive systemic inflammation. The epidemiological data showed that even tiny amounts of trans fats aggressively drove up the risk of coronary heart disease.
And Willett was calling this out.
He was one of the loudest, earliest voices sounding the alarm on trans fats, while the establishment was still heavily pushing margarine.
It is the ultimate tragic game of whack-a-mole.
That is exactly what it does.
It perfectly describes what happened to the American diet. The health authorities took a giant, blunt mallet and whacked down fat. But because foods still needed to be palatable and the structural integrity of processed foods needed to be maintained.
Something else had to pop up.
Right. A giant, terrifying mole labeled sugar, refined carbohydrates, and trans fats popped right up in its place. We pushed down naturally occurring fats, and metabolic dysfunction popped up everywhere, ultimately destroying our collective health.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the public health disaster of the late 20th century. When you systematically remove fat from a product, you inherently strip away the flavor.
And the satiety.
Exactly, the biological mechanism for satiety. Fat delays gastric emptying and makes you feel full.
So without fat, you're just hungry and eating cardboard.
To compensate for the taste of cardboard, manufacturers backfilled these fat-free products with massive amounts of high-fructose corn syrup and highly refined starches.
So people thought they were doing the right thing.
Consumers were diligently eating these fat-free cookies and low-fat yogurts, feeling incredibly virtuous and compliant with the USDA guidelines.
But they were actually poisoning their metabolism.
They were ingesting a massive glycemic load that spiked their blood sugar, drove hyperinsulinemia, and initiated de novo lipogenesis.
Which is what exactly?
The body literally converting those excess carbohydrates straight into triglycerides. Willett's data unequivocally proved that swapping naturally occurring healthy fats like the monounsaturated fats in olive oil or the omega-3s in walnuts and fatty fish for highly refined carbohydrates was a biologically disastrous trade for the human heart.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the mention of refined carbs naturally bridges us right into Willett's absolute rules on the carbohydrate family.
Which is the next major pillar of his pyramid.
If dietary fat isn't the ultimate villain we were led to believe, and we just accidentally replaced it with metabolically destructive carbs, we need to know how to accurately navigate the carbohydrate world.
We do.
And according to the epidemiological data, just like fat, carbohydrates are not a monolith.
They are absolutely not a monolith, and treating them as such was another fatal flaw of the old USDA pyramid.
Treating a bagel the same as a bowl of beans.
Exactly. Willett's text decisively divides carbohydrates into two distinct camps based entirely on their physiological and hormonal effects.
Protective versus pathogenic.
Yes. The protective carbohydrates are intact, whole grains, fibrous vegetables, whole fruits, and legumes. The pathogenic carbohydrates are white bread, sugary beverages, and literally any form of heavily refined, pulverized flour.
And the difference comes down to blood sugar.
The underlying biochemical mechanism that separates the protective from the pathogenic is the concept of glycemic load.
Now, I know you listening are already familiar with the general concept of blood sugar and the glycemic index. We've all experienced that brutal afternoon energy crash after eating a massive plate of pasta for lunch.
We certainly have.
But Willett's focus goes far beyond just saying sugar is bad. He focuses intensely on the structural processing of the grain itself.
The physical architecture of the food.
Right. We aren't just talking about table sugar. We are talking about the fact that a seemingly savory slice of modern whole wheat bread can actually trigger a sharper insulin response than a literal candy bar.
Which shocks a lot of people.
How is that biochemically possible?
It comes down to cellular architecture and the modernization of agriculture. When we talk about intact whole grains like oat groats or barley, the starch is physically locked inside a fibrous matrix.
The bran and the germ?
Specifically the bran and the germ. Your digestive enzymes have to work incredibly hard over a long period of time to break down that fiber and access the starch.
So it's a slow release.
This results in a slow, highly controlled trickle of glucose into your bloodstream. However, modern milling processes take that grain and pulverize it into an ultra-fine microscopic dust.
They strip away all the protection.
They strip away the bran and the germ, leaving only the starchy endosperm. Furthermore, modern dwarf wheat contains a specific starch structure called amylopectin A.
Amylopectin A, what does that do?
It is highly branched and uniquely susceptible to rapid digestion. When you consume bread made from this pulverized flour, your salivary amylase begins converting that massive surface area of starch into pure glucose the exact second it hits your tongue.
And that triggers the massive insulin cascade.
Exactly. The glucose floods your bloodstream instantaneously. Your pancreas panics and dumps a massive compensatory bolus of insulin to force that toxic level of glucose out of your blood into your cells.
And then what happens?
Because the insulin response is so aggressive, it often overshoots. It clears too much glucose too quickly, plunging you into reactive hypoglycemia.
That is the 3 p.m. crash.
That is the crash. And worse, when your blood sugar plummets, your body releases stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline to counter-regulate it.
Which makes you crave more carbs.
It triggers intense primal cravings for more rapidly digesting carbohydrates. It is a vicious, artificially induced hormonal loop.
You can actually see this physiological reality visually represented in the structure of Willett's healthy eating pyramid.
The visual is very striking.
It is a stunning visual correction of the USDA's mistakes. Intact whole grains are placed right near the base, sitting comfortably at level 2, right alongside those healthy monounsaturated fats we just talked about.
The olive oils and the avocados.
Right. They're recognized as a core daily metabolic necessity. Meanwhile, refined grains, white rice, pasta, and sugary drinks. They are banished entirely to the very top tip of the pyramid right next to candy in the use sparingly category.
It visually separates the medicine from the poison within the carbohydrate family. By prioritizing glycemic load over simple carbohydrate volume, Willett aligns the dietary advice with actual human endocrinology rather than agricultural surplus.
Okay, so we've conquered the lipid profiles and we've navigated the treacherous high glycemic waters of carbohydrates. Now we have to talk about building the structural proteins of our bodies.
Building blocks.
And honestly, this section contains one of the biggest points of friction in the entire text. Let's start with the proteins themselves. The epidemiological data strongly biases toward plant-based proteins over animal sources.
It does. The long-term data points remarkably clearly toward the health benefits of deriving your amino acids primarily from plant sources or highly specific animal sources, rather than relying heavily on mammalian meat.
What are the optimal choices in his model?
The optimal choices outlined are legumes, nuts, seeds, poultry, and fish, specifically fatty fish rich in omega-3s. These provide the necessary building blocks for muscle synthesis without the accompanying inflammatory packages found in other sources.
Let me push back here, because this is where the conventional wisdom really digs its heels in.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
For decades, the fitness industry and diet culture have pushed the narrative of incomplete proteins. The idea that plant proteins like beans or lentils are missing essential amino acids, and therefore you absolutely must consume steak, eggs, or whey protein to achieve true muscle synthesis and health.
That's a very pervasive idea.
Is Willett's push for plant protein ignoring the biological necessity of a complete amino acid profile?
That is a very common objection.
Yeah.
But it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human digestion.
How so?
The concept of the incomplete protein is largely a myth that was debunked decades ago, yet it just persists in pop culture.
Okay.
It is true that a single plant source, like a lentil, might be slightly lower in a specific amino acid, like methionine, compared to a piece of beef. However, your body maintains a free amino acid pool in your liver and your bloodstream. If you are eating a reasonably varied diet containing beans, grains, nuts, and vegetables throughout the day, your body is highly efficient at combining those circulating amino acids to form complete proteins.
So you don't need all of them in one single meal.
You do not need every single essential amino acid in perfect proportion in every single bite of food. Willett's data from the health cohorts consistently show that substituting just one serving of red meat per day with a plant-based protein source like nuts or legumes was associated with a significant drop in all-cause mortality.
Because the limit list in his pyramid is very explicit. Red meat and processed meat are grouped together at the very top.
Yes, the data on processed meats, your bacon, hot dogs, deli meats, is practically unassailable at this point.
Because of the preservatives.
The preservatives, specifically nitrates and nitrites, form carcinogenic nitrosamines in the gut. But even with unprocessed red meat, Willett points to the high levels of heme iron, which can act as a pro-oxidant.
And the saturated fat.
And the specific types of saturated fats that, while perhaps not as demonized as they once were, still do not offer the cardioprotective benefits of the fats found in fish or walnuts.
But the real shock value for me, and I know for you listening, this is where the cognitive dissonance really hits hard, is the text's stance on dairy.
Ah, yes, the dairy debate.
The source material marks dairy as entirely optional. Optional. I mean, I grew up with the 90s milk mustache campaigns.
We all did. Got milk.
Exactly. We were bombarded with marketing telling us that if we didn't drink 3 massive glasses of milk a day, our bones would essentially disintegrate into dust.
That was perhaps one of the most brilliant, deeply ingrained, and scientifically questionable public health marketing campaigns of the 20th century.
It was incredibly effective.
The prevailing assumption, heavily funded by the dairy lobby, was that massive dairy intake was absolutely essential for calcium acquisition, and therefore linearly correlated with bone health and fracture prevention. Willett's epidemiological analysis fundamentally, and quite bravely, challenges that entire paradigm.
So I have to challenge this directly. If dairy is optional, where are we supposed to get the calcium?
There are plenty of other sources.
Because the immediate counter-argument is always leafy greens. Just eat spinach. But anyone who has looked at the biochemistry of spinach knows it is loaded with oxalates,
which are anti-nutrients.
compounds that bind to calcium in the gut and severely limit its bioavailability. You would have to eat an impossibly massive amount of spinach to absorb the same amount of usable calcium as a single glass of milk.
You're not wrong about spinach.
So how does Willett justify sidelining dairy when the bioavailability of calcium in plants is often so poor?
You are absolutely correct about the oxalates in spinach. It is a terrible primary source for bioavailable calcium. But Willett does not rely on spinach.
What does he point to?
He points to other cruciferous vegetables like kale, broccoli, and bok choy. These are incredibly low in oxalates and actually have calcium absorption rates that are significantly higher than milk.
Really? Higher absorption than milk?
Yes. Furthermore, he points to fortified alternative milks, tofu set with calcium, and even targeted supplementation if a clinical deficiency is present. But Willett goes deeper than just the mechanics of absorption.
He looks at the outcomes.
He looks at the actual epidemiological outcomes. This is often referred to as the calcium paradox.
The calcium paradox. Explain that.
When Willett and other researchers looked at the global data, they found that the countries with the absolute highest rates of dairy consumption, like the United States, Sweden, and Finland, also paradoxically possess the highest rates of osteoporotic hip fractures.
Wait, really? The countries drinking the most milk actually have the weakest bones?
Exactly. Because bone health is not a simple equation of just pouring calcium into the body. It is a highly complex matrix.
What else is involved?
It involves vitamin D, vitamin K2, which actually directs the calcium into the bone rather than letting it calcify the arteries, magnesium, and importantly, physical activity.
Going back to the base of the pyramid.
Right. Willett's data suggests that forcing massive amounts of dairy into the adult human diet isn't just unnecessary for bone health, it may carry other risks.
Like what?
He notes the correlation in some cohorts between high dairy consumption and elevated risks of certain hormonally driven cancers. This is potentially linked to the IGF-1 pathways, the insulin-like growth factor 1 pathways stimulated by dairy proteins.
Wow.
Therefore, he demotes dairy from a daily necessity to an optional 1 to 2 servings maximum, placing it far lower in importance than water or tea.
It is so wild to see red meat and butter, the absolute unquestioned staples of the traditional American diet, placed on the exact same restricted, use sparingly level as refined grains and sugary sweets at the top of his pyramid.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that Willett's approach is radically restructuring our biological defaults. He is systematically dismantling the idea that any single food group, especially those historically backed by massive agricultural lobbying, is strictly mandatory for human survival.
Especially if the nutrients can be found elsewhere.
If the requisite nutrients can be sourced more safely and efficiently elsewhere, there are no mandatory foods.
This brings us perfectly to what we might call the supporting cast of our daily diet.
Yeah.
We've got our healthy fats, our low glycemic carbs, and our optimal proteins sorted.
The main pillars.
But what about the other things we consume on a daily basis? Let's talk about fruits and vegetables. I was honestly a little taken aback by the incredibly grounded, almost muted take on fruits and vegetables in the source text.
In what sense?
Well, they're obviously highlighted as important. They occupy a massive portion of the foundational levels. But the text specifically goes out of its way to point out that they are not magical cure-alls.
Right.
I feel like in our current pop nutrition culture, we're constantly sold on the idea of the superfood. We are told that an acai bowl or a specialized green smoothie will instantly neutralize free radicals, cure all our ailments, and offset a weekend of terrible eating.
The magic bullet mentality.
But Willett frames them just as solid, necessary foundational components. He seems to suggest they reduce disease risk only when they are a part of an overall synergistic dietary pattern, not as standalone pharmacological magic bullets.
What you are hearing there is the voice of a pure, rigorous epidemiologist. When you look at health data spanning decades, you realize that human metabolism doesn't work on a ledger system.
A ledger system.
Right. A bowl of blueberries does not cancel out a plate of trans fat-laden French fries. Adding a handful of antioxidant-rich kale to a diet that is structurally fundamentally broken, driven by hyperinsulinemia and excess saturated fat, is not going to magically halt atherogenesis.
It can't undo the damage.
Fruits and vegetables are absolutely vital. They provide essential thousands of phytochemicals, flavonoids, and the necessary soluble and insoluble fiber that feeds the gut microbiome. But their protective effects are profoundly magnified when they act synergistically within a high-quality dietary pattern.
They are the mortar, but you still need the right bricks.
That is a perfect analogy.
And then there is the incredibly nuanced guidance on alcohol. The text states that moderate intake, specifically defining it and noting it as best consumed with meals, may actually reduce heart disease risk in older adults.
But there is the caveat.
A massive flashing caveat that it is absolutely not recommended for everyone.
This is a perfect example of the extreme care required in public health messaging, and it highlights a statistical phenomenon known as the J-curve.
The J-curve, tell us about that.
The epidemiological data over and over again shows a J-shaped curve when graphing alcohol consumption against mortality. Those who consume zero alcohol have a baseline risk. Those who consume light to moderate amounts think a single glass of wine with dinner actually show a slight dip in cardiovascular disease risk.
Because of the HDL.
Likely due to alcohol's effect on raising HDL cholesterol and its mild anticoagulant properties. However, as consumption increases beyond that moderate window, the curve shoots violently upward.
The long stem of the J.
Exactly. The risk for liver disease, addiction, and critically, several types of cancer, particularly breast cancer, skyrockets.
So the data is saying it might help your heart slightly, but it increases your cancer risk simultaneously.
Exactly. It is a biological trade-off. Therefore, the recommendation must be highly personalized to the patient's family history. A blanket public health statement telling everyone to drink a glass of wine for heart health would be incredibly scientifically irresponsible.
Because it would drive up addiction and cancer rates?
In susceptible populations, absolutely. Willett approaches it with pure pragmatism. If you don't drink, don't start. If you do drink, keep it strictly moderate.
That same deep pragmatism applies to his take on multivitamins. The text describes a daily multivitamin simply as basic nutritional insurance to fill microscopic gaps.
Explicitly stating it is not a replacement for a good diet.
Which is an important distinction.
A synthetic pill can never replicate the complex, thousands-deep matrix of phytochemicals, fiber, and cofactors found in a whole food meal. However, Willett recognizes the reality of modern life.
Nobody is perfect.
Even with the best intentions, people have gaps in their diet. He particularly highlights the importance of B vitamins, like folate and vitamin D in these multivitamins.
What does folate do again?
Folate is critical for DNA methylation and repair, and adequate levels are strongly correlated with lower risks of colon cancer and cardiovascular disease. Taking a multivitamin is like having a safety net. It catches those minor subclinical deficiencies.
But it cannot support you if you simply refuse to walk on the tightrope of healthy eating.
Exactly right.
Okay, so we have gathered all these incredible macro-level pieces of epidemiological information. We understand the historical failures, we have the lipid data, we understand the glycemic mechanisms.
The theory is sound.
But how does this actually manifest on a Tuesday night when you are standing in your kitchen, tired after a long day of work? The source material brilliantly translates this abstract, decades-long data into a Willett-style daily plate.
It makes it actionable.
It takes the epidemiology and makes it fiercely actionable for your very next meal.
Translation to behavior is the ultimate goal of any public health initiative. When we move from the macro-level statistics of 120,000 nurses down to the micro-level of a single 9-inch dinner plate, the scientific principles remain incredibly robust.
It's way better than my plate.
It is a massive improvement over the USDA's current MyPlate iteration, which honestly still leaves too much room for interpretation regarding grain quality and protein sources.
So let's visually build this Willett plate together for you right now. Imagine a standard dinner plate. According to his translation of the epidemiology, half of that plate, 50% of the entire physical real estate, should be covered in vegetables and fruits.
And we are talking very colorful vegetables.
Right, not just a massive pile of potatoes. Then a quarter of the plate is strictly dedicated to intact whole grains. Think brown rice, quinoa, or whole wheat berries.
To low glycemic carbs.
The final quarter of the plate is reserved for your healthy protein. Beans, lentils, fish, or chicken. And to top it off, instead of avoiding fat, you actively include a healthy fat source.
Like a heavy drizzle of extra virgin olive oil.
Or a sprinkle of walnuts. And you pair the entire meal with water, tea, or coffee, strictly avoiding sugary sodas or juices.
When you visualize that plate, you are looking at the culmination of a lifetime of epidemiological research. It is the physical manifestation of hormonal balance.
It's beautiful in its simplicity.
It perfectly encapsulates the core lesson of Willett's entire thesis. Dietary patterns over time matter exponentially more than short-term restrictive deprivation. If you can make your plate look roughly like that for the vast majority of your meals over the course of years and decades,
you change your destiny.
The data unequivocally suggests you are dramatically tipping the scales of long-term health and longevity in your favor. It ensures you are getting the low glycemic load to keep insulin quiet, the healthy fats to maintain endothelial health, the optimal amino acids for repair, and the necessary micronutrients.
All while naturally controlling your weight without the misery of starvation. It sounds so incredibly logical and, frankly, deeply sustainable. But, as with any scientific deep dive we do on this show, we have to look at the entire unfiltered picture.
We can't ignore the critics.
No scientific model, no matter how statistically robust or historically corrective, is entirely without its critics or limitations within the scientific community. The source text makes sure to outline the ongoing critiques from other nutrition experts regarding Willett's methodology.
This raises an important question about the fundamental nature of the data itself. The heaviest and most consistent critique leveled at Willett's work centers on his near-total reliance on observational epidemiology.
Right, because it's not a controlled lab.
While cohorts like the Nurses' Health Study are massive, meticulously maintained, and well-respected, they are, by their very definition, observational. This means researchers observe what people freely choose to eat and track their subsequent health outcomes.
They don't dictate what they eat.
They do not dictate the interventions.
Which brings us back to one of the most persistent hurdles in this type of research. Let's dig into the concept of healthy user bias and residual confounding. Because when you are just watching people live their lives, it is incredibly difficult to untangle the web of their behaviors.
Precisely. Healthy user bias is the absolute bane of epidemiology.
Yeah.
For example, people who go out of their way to eat a lot of quinoa, kale, and salmon following Willett's advice might also happen to be people who sleep 8 hours a night.
They practice stress reduction.
They have gym memberships, they smoke less, and they have premium access to top-tier preventative health care.
Conversely, the person eating the processed hot dog
Might also be working night shifts, experiencing chronic financial stress, and smoking. While Willett and his team use incredibly complex multivariable statistical models to mathematically isolate the effect of the food itself and control for these lifestyle factors,
it's never perfect.
observational studies can never entirely eliminate residual confounding. It cannot prove physiological causation with the absolute ironclad certainty of a rigorously controlled randomized clinical trial where you lock subjects in a metabolic ward and precisely dictate every single molecule they consume.
But doing that for 50 years is impossible.
Running a 50-year, tightly controlled, randomized trial on the human diet is virtually impossible, financially ruinous, and highly unethical. So despite its limitations, observational data remains the best tool we possess for understanding multi-decade trends.
Another significant limitation the scientific community brings up is the reality of individual genetic variation. We are learning so much about nutrigenomics right now.
It's an exploding field.
The idea is that genetics and metabolisms differ so wildly from person to person that a single unified pyramid might be overly ambitious.
That is a highly valid critique. We know, for instance, that individuals carrying the APOE4 genetic variant, which is strongly linked to Alzheimer's disease processed dietary fats, vary differently than the general population.
So Willett's fat advice might not work for them.
For them, even some normally healthy fats might need to be carefully monitored. Other individuals might have specific gut microbiome compositions that make them thrive on a slightly higher carbohydrate intake.
Or they might need more fat depending on their baseline insulin sensitivity.
Exactly. A one-size-fits-all pyramid, even one as meticulously, scientifically grounded as Willett's, cannot perfectly map onto every single person's unique biological blueprint.
And we also have to acknowledge the ongoing ferocious debate over dairy that we touched on earlier. While Willett remains highly skeptical of dairy's necessity and its long-term benefits, the text notes that some modern research still supports it.
Particularly surrounding fermented dairy like kefir and specific types of full-fat yogurt.
Right. They strongly support their metabolic and microbiome benefits. It is not a completely settled, closed-book science.
That is the beautiful, iterative nature of scientific inquiry. It is always evolving and refining itself. However, despite these valid methodological critiques, the reality of healthy user bias and the nuances of individual genetic polymorphisms.
If you zoom out,
If we synthesize all of this data, will its overarching recommendations still strongly align with the most modern, evidence-based public health guidelines globally?
the big picture holds up.
The macro-level shift away from refined, pulverized carbohydrates and industrialized trans fats toward intact whole foods, monounsaturated fats, and plant-based proteins is virtually universally accepted among serious, unbiased nutrition scientists today.
So what does this all mean for us as we wrap up this deep dive? Let's recap the ultimate actionable takeaways that you can literally carry with you to the grocery store today.
The practical application.
First and foremost, physiological food quality beats raw calorie counting every single time. Stop obsessing over the math and start looking at the biological information the food is sending your body.
Food is information.
Healthy fats, your extra virgin olive oils, your walnuts, your avocados, they are your cellular friends, not your enemies. It is time to aggressively ditch the refined, rapid-digesting carbs and sugary drinks and swap them for intact, complex foods that keep your insulin quiet and your blood sugar steady.
Keep the insulin quiet, exactly.
Prioritize plant-based proteins and high-quality fish over heavily processed deli meats. And perhaps most importantly, serving as the biological bedrock of it all. Keep your metabolic engine running by moving your body every single day.
Willett's work and the decades of data behind it fundamentally shifted the entire landscape of nutrition science. It pulled us out of the misguided, industry-influenced, low-fat obsession of the late 20th century and pointed us toward holistic, sustainable, long-term dietary patterns.
A much healthier relationship with food.
The ultimate takeaway for you is that true metabolic health is about building evidence-based biological habits. It is not about chasing the latest 6-week fad diet, starving yourself, or demonizing a single macronutrient. It is about consistent, high-quality inputs over a lifetime.
Which leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought for you to mull over on your own as you go about your week. We've spent this entire time talking about how long-term epidemiological studies take literally decades to prove the biological effects of a dietary pattern.
Decades.
Willett and his team had to watch hundreds of thousands of people for 30, 40 years just to definitively prove what refined flour and artificial trans fats actually did to the human cardiovascular system.
It takes time to see the damage.
So, if decades of observation is the required gold standard for understanding food safety, how on earth do we evaluate the hidden health impacts of the countless new, hyper-engineered, ultra-processed food alternatives that are being invented in laboratories and hitting our grocery store shelves every single month?
We can't know.
If it takes 50 years to truly know the physiological truth of a new food, are we currently the unwitting subjects of the next 50-year observational study?
That is a chilling but absolutely essential question to consider as we navigate the modern food environment.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this empowers you to confidently step off the exhaustive diet treadmill, ignore the confusing headlines, and think completely differently about the metabolic power of your very next meal.